And so, Anna, I think, can anybody check the YouTube? And if I'm going to send you the link, and I hope this is.
I'm in the YouTube link.
Yeah.
Do you want me to check anything?
Oh yeah, please. Just go to my main page, and then because the one I created.
Oh, I see. Yeah, there seems to be.
Yeah. Oh yeah, please. Just go to my main page.
So Kazuya, I went to your main page and it took me to another link, but the one you sent in the leaflet is also open, but it's not linked, and there are several people there.
Sure. Yeah, I'll let people know that I've just created another one, which is, I think, working. So
yeah. Perhaps you can put it in the comment box in the other one, because people are following there.
Yes. Yeah, thanks, Eloy. Yeah.
We start?
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the London Second Language Acquisition Research Forum Annual Colloquium 2021. I'm Anna Pellicer-Sanchez from the UCL Institute of Education. Thank you very much for joining us today. We have an exciting program with 5 presentations by 5 of our LSLARF members on a range of topics on second language acquisition research. As you know, each presentation will be 20 minutes, followed by 10 minutes of questions and answers. Please feel free to leave your comments or questions in the YouTube comments box, and we will keep an eye and we'll be reading out those questions to the presenters. So please use the YouTube box to add your questions or comments. I think that's all for the introduction. Thank you very much for joining. We really hope that you enjoy the event. And I think we can start with our first presentation by Professor Jean-Marc Dewaele. I'll just stop sharing and leave it all to you, Jean-Marc.
Okay, thank you, Anna. And it's a pleasure to see the colleagues again. We haven't seen much of each other in the past year, or at least less than we used to. So it's great to see you, even if it's only thumb size. I will start sharing my screen and explain a little bit what it is that I'm going to talk about today. Is this showing? Good. Okay, well, I think since we have a couple of PhD students attending the session, that it is useful to say a little bit about the background of this study, because it's easy to think when you're a student that frustration is unique to the student experience, and that supervisors are unduly harsh and critical, and that they never seem to approve of your work. So the paper I'm presenting today, in fact, Peter and I wrote the first draft of it and submitted it to a first version to a journal in 2012. And it was rejected, and we agreed that the comments of the 3 reviewers were absolutely correct, and that they pointed out problems with the paper that we could not easily overcome. So after thinking for a little bit, we decided to put it in a drawer. And so the paper remained in the back of my mind, and during many long walks, I thought about ways to get around some fundamental problems in this paper. And then about 2 years ago, I suddenly got thought about a way to overcome the obstacles, and Peter and I submitted the paper, the new version, to the Modern Language Journal in July of last year. It took them a while before we got the review, but in the end we got a review. They asked for minor revisions. We submitted a revised version in November, and we've been waiting ever since, which is really highly frustrating, because you get things out. It's like, you know, you bake a new cake, you bake a bread, it comes fresh out of the oven, and you present it to your reviewers, and then you wait for months and months and months, and you don't hear anything even after asking for the reviewer for updates. So that's a kind of a frustration that I guess most of my colleagues have experienced, and it's important to point out to students that senior researchers can also get really frustrated about how slow things go, and everything should be faster. Just a quick word about the theoretical background of this paper. You will have noticed the word flow in the title. It's really linked to positive psychology, which is focused on how normal people live. It's an approach in psychology that doesn't focus on the deficits, but rather on the things that go well in life. So they look at all kinds of positive psychological attributes like grit, resilience, hope, and obviously also flow. I think it is particularly relevant for teaching, because I realized that to be a good teacher, in fact, you need to adopt these tenets of positive psychology. You need to be optimistic about the potential of your learners to actually learn something and remember something about what you teach them. And as Fredrickson pointed out, positive emotions play a particularly important role, because it puts the learners in the kind of right psychological mood. It allows them to absorb new information more quickly, whereas if they are in a negative mood, if they are anxious, then they typically narrow their focus, they feel threatened, and they kind of shut down the shutters. So that's not the best way to learn new things. So a quick word about flow. It's linked to this man whose name I cannot pronounce. So I will call him Mr. C, who defined flow as that state where you are completely involved in an activity for its own sake, where the ego falls away, time flies, action, movement, everything is natural. You are in the zone. And I'm looking at Peter, and I remember how much he enjoys playing tennis. So in fact, it is something that you could have doing different things, not just language learning. It could be simply an activity that you're doing, and suddenly you realize that you are in the zone. And it is highly motivating. But it doesn't, so it means that it is not boring, or it's not too easy. So it's really a matter of a balance between the challenge of the task and the skills that you have. So you have clear goals, unambiguous feedback, action and awareness go together. You are totally concentrated, you feel in control, and time disappears and self-consciousness disappears. And so it is an intrinsically motivating activity. So there is this narrow channel for flow, because if the challenge becomes a bit too high, you might suddenly fall out of flow and abandon. I mean, you're out of that fantastic channel. If your skill set is not matched with the level of challenge, you're out of flow. So it is relatively hard to reach that state, but once you are there, it seems like it could go on forever. And if you are a language teacher, you know that sometimes everything goes right in the classroom and everybody is in a state of group flow, and that's absolutely brilliant. And then at some point, towards the end of class, hopefully, you fall out of flow and suddenly you realize that yourself and your students are all very tired because you've been giving your very best during a long time, and suddenly you're out of flow, and suddenly you realize, oh God, I'm hungry, I'm tired, I need to go home. So this study on flow is really within the area of emotion, second language acquisition, and multilingualism. I've pleaded for years for more attention to the emotional components of second language learning, shown also recently that there is a clear link between attitudes and motivation and learners' short-term emotions. So if you feel happy and you are in a positive mood, then you are typically more motivated, and vice versa, of course. So with Peter, a little picture there where we presented our paper in 2012, The Two Faces of Janus. We decided that, in fact, we needed a more holistic view on emotions in the foreign language context, not just on anxiety and negative emotions. We needed something positive. And in fact, this paper is close to becoming my most cited paper. So we use the definition of foreign language anxiety by Horowitz, well known, about anxiety that second language learners have in coming across as a bit clumsy in the second language. And we defined enjoyment as a broad positive emotion experienced when psychological needs of the learner were met during challenging language learning activities. So you see that we were, in fact, already there referring to flow and positive psychology. So from our study, we had some qualitative feedback from our participants. We found that they typically enjoy things that empowers them, that gives them a degree of autonomy, that allows them to bond with classmates and be creative. Also important, they enjoy the praise of their mates and their teacher, their encouragement, and also a general atmosphere of trust, respect, and joking or humor by the teacher. So in many studies on enjoyment and anxiety, we discovered similar patterns across the world. So typically older students, female, multilingual, more advanced, more proficient, with higher levels of relative standing in the group, with positive attitudes towards the foreign language, score higher on enjoyment. And also we discovered that enjoyment is very much linked to the teacher, teacher characteristics and behavior in the classroom. So is the teacher using the foreign language? Is the teacher friendly, joking, enthusiastic? And in fact, that's a paper that came out just today with Chen Li on the importance of teacher enthusiasm to banish boredom, boost enjoyment, and increase student engagement. Anxiety is more linked to learner internal variables, like having a lower relatively standing among the peers, being more neurotic. also linked to a number of other variables that you see there. Also things like lower levels of proficiency or being a beginner, having had disappointing test results, and having a teacher that is very strict or unfriendly. But typically, the teacher plays a relatively little role in explaining variance in anxiety. So the teacher can't really do much about the anxiety of their learners. We did find in a meta-analysis with Botes that anxiety is generally negatively correlated with academic achievement, and that enjoyment is in fact positively correlated with academic achievement. So I think this is a powerful argument that emotions matter. It makes a difference in the achievement of learners. So here are a couple of studies on flow, fewer than I would have expected also, but still, they show that flow experience can happen in the classroom, that it is linked to task design, that learners in a state of flow are better able to remember new words that they hear, that having the right combination of challenge and skill is really crucial, that it depends a little bit on the kind of task that students do in the classroom, but that it is typically linked to high levels of motivation. Also that flow experiences are sustained by positive emotionality, and that the concept of flow is in fact still under research with regard to work on language learners' motivation. So the research questions in the present paper was in fact, how often does it happen that a foreign language learner is in a state of flow? What is it linked to? Is it linked to enjoyment and anxiety? And to what extent is positive intensity of learners' description of an enjoyable episode linked to how advanced they are in their language learning, their relative standing in class, and the duration and source of enjoyment. So let me say something more about the methodology. 1,044 participants extracted from the database that I collected with Peter in 2014, based on an online questionnaire where we collected both quantitative and qualitative data. We used the experience sampling method. So we asked our participants to tell us what proportion of time in the foreign language class they felt totally absorbed, losing the sense of time, feeling fulfilled and happy, which are 4 characteristics of flow. As you see, the Cronbach alpha was pretty high. We also got satisfactory internal consistency for enjoyment and anxiety, and 581 participants answered the open question on what an enjoyable episode in their foreign language class. So we coded that experience for 3 dimensions: source, duration, and intensity of enjoyment. So as you see, a number of different sources, 3 levels for duration, and 3 levels for intensity, where high intensity happened if they mentioned at least one of the characteristics of flow. So here are the results. We discovered that, in fact, our participants were on average almost 60% of the time in a state of flow, which may appear to be quite a lot, but we have to trust what our participants said. We discovered that it was significantly linked to how advanced they were, so that the more advanced learners, in fact, experience significantly higher proportion of time in a state of flow. Also, those who felt that they were below the average in the group typically were much less in a state of flow than those who felt average or above average in their group. And then we looked at predictors of flow, and we discovered that enjoyment is in fact the strongest predictor, and that anxiety does not predict flow at all. So it means that whether you are anxious or not as you are doing that activity has no effect on you being in a state of flow. And then looking at the effect of positive intensity, on the proportion of time in flow. As you see, people who described an episode with a high level of intensity typically spend more time in a state of flow. Also, more advanced learners, as you see, spend a bigger proportion of time in a state of flow. So beginners typically didn't reach that state as often as more advanced learners. And then looking at intensity level, again, you see people whose episode expressed a high level of positive intensity. They were typically the students who felt that they were above average in their classroom. And then looking at the sources of flow, you again see a systematic shift over for those reporting high levels of positive intensity and flow, namely that the source of it was typically those who included both peers and teacher linked to the self, whereas those with low levels of positive intensity reported more episodes linked to themselves rather than the teachers or the peers. And then finally, the duration of the episode, as you see again, those experiencing high levels of flow were in a state of flow for much longer than those whose episodes only reflected low levels of enjoyment and no flow. So we included some learner voices. Amy, who talks about the light bulb moment that she had, suddenly able to express herself and suddenly reaching a state of flow, even if it wasn't very long because her skills were relatively limited, but she was shocked by her ability. So, you know, you say, is that me speaking Spanish? She seemed very happy about that. And then teacher-induced moments of enjoyment, like a fantastic teacher teaching for an hour and a half, and it seems to the student that it passed in 2 minutes. So it's clear that Eunice was in a state of flow. And then Agatha, who talks about group-induced moments of flow, where they had to debate in two opposite groups, and it was so fantastic, and she forgot about time, and she felt that that class had really contributed to her progress in the foreign language. So briefly, discussion, it's clear that the ontogenesis of flow, that the same ontogenesis emerged from both quantitative and qualitative analysis, that early flow experiences are really like sparks. They are self-centered, infrequent, short-lived, and they gradually become stronger and more intense and go on for longer. And it's clear also that the flow experience depends on the individual social standing in the class. So a short conclusion, given the role of positive emotions in broadening one's experience and facilitating exploration, playing with ideas, it's clear that flow experiences are in fact both a result and a contributing factor for progress in the foreign language. And here are a couple of references, and I'd be happy to send you papers if you are interested in them. So I hope we have some time left for questions. Thank you.
Excellent, thanks a lot. Yeah, Marc, thanks a lot for the presentation. We do have a few minutes for questions, so please, any comments, questions? Parvaneh, is that a hand up? Yes, go ahead.
And I think Peter also had his hand up. Peter, you go first.
Oh, no, you go first.
Jean-Marc, thank you very much. This is a very interesting topic and a very interesting paper. You are reporting that proficiency was linked with experiencing more flow. First of all, how was proficiency assessed? Was it a self-report?
Yes, because we had participants from all around the world with many different languages, so it was impossible to test their actual proficiency.
Yeah, and I'm thinking that if that is taken as an important finding of your research, it has some kind of significant implications for language teaching. With advanced learners, they are engaged in a kind of flow. Maybe with beginner learners, there is a lot more to do. And that leads me to the next question, which is, are there any strategies that teachers can develop to generate, promote flow?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's the challenge of any language teacher to make the students forget that they are in a language class, in a relatively artificial situation, sitting at a desk, make the classroom walls disappear, make them focus on something that gets their heart beating. And, I absolutely love that, especially on Friday nights at Birkbeck, between 6 and 9, when everybody was tired and thinking about their friends at the pub, etc. I had to make sure that they got in a state of flow and forgot that it was Friday night. And it means doing fun, unpredictable things, but also challenging things, and then more easy things. So I think variation is probably the key to get there. And I would say that it works just as well for beginners as for more advanced learners. Maybe beginners need a little bit more variation. Advanced learners may want to spend more time on a single task that they enjoy. So I think there are some differences. And I would in fact love to see intervention studies where to see whether teachers can be taught to induce states of flow among their students. And obviously, as the teacher, you need to be in that flow too. You cannot be outside the group. You are very much part, you are the inspiration. It is your enthusiasm that pushes people into a state of flow.
Thanks, Jean-Marc.
Do we still have time?
Yeah, Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, I was interested that there was greater suggestions of flow with the more advanced students.
Yes.
I wondered, not so much in your study perhaps, but more generally in flow research, has there been much longitudinal research? Because I wondered whether the higher proportion that we saw with the advanced learners is who gets to be an advanced learner? Somebody who sticks with it and who is successful. Were these the same people who were in the beginner classes, as it were, where there was lower flow, but they were the ones who accounted for the flow in the lower classes? And there's a self-selection involved by the time you get to the advanced level. So I wondered, is there any longitudinal work?
Peter, I could give you a hug because you pointed.
Really?
Exactly.
You don't live far away, Jean-Marc.
I know. I will just come over, I can be there in 10 minutes. You're absolutely right. It is longitudinal research is always the gold standard. And it's obviously always the hardest thing to get because it's hard to get sufficient number of people giving you data over a long period of time. It's hard. So it could probably be done, but on smaller and maybe intact classes. That would be absolutely possible. And I also agree that it is very likely that, in fact, foreign language learners who don't enjoy it very much and who are seldom in a state of flow just give up. So that the more advanced learners are by definition the ones who had most flow, most enjoyment, and carried on studying the foreign language. So that was an excellent observation. Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? We have a couple of minutes.
I'll ask another quick one then, Jean-Marc.
Go ahead, Peter.
Is there any evidence on language aptitude in relation to flow?
I am not aware of that. In fact, I haven't seen anything linking flow to language aptitude, but that would be an interesting research question. So if we have a master's student or a PhD student unhappy with his or her current research project, that would be a great thing to do. So contact me.
I just have a comment. It would be fantastic to see like a handbook for students or for future teachers to kind of how to encourage that state of flow, almost like tips and tricks, you know, that you've described, because I think it's also the focus is a lot on the teacher, right? So it's sort of almost like the teacher's responsibility, as you said, Marc, to make the walls disappear, and kind of, so the focus is on the teacher. So I think it would be great to see some sort of support, you know, because I think, I don't know, it's just an observation. It's also linked to a personality in a way, like what kind of personality you have as a teacher as well. So it's kind of what can we all adopt in a way that would potentially encourage that flow, you know, in our classrooms.
I totally agree. Absolutely. I think there is no guarantee, though, that it would work. Just like, you know, having, we have lots of cookbooks at home. And sometimes I try to prepare something using the book. And the pictures look fantastic, but whatever it is that I produce never look remotely as fantastic and never taste quite as well as they should, because I'm probably not a brilliant cook. So I think that reading about recipes to be a good teacher is certainly helpful, but there is no guarantee that it will, that the teacher will actually be able to pull it off, because it's pretty challenging. And I agree with you, Victoria. It depends a lot on the personality of the teacher, and you can't really fake an alternative personality, I guess. So thank you.
Thank you very much for the comments and questions. I can see that there is one question coming from our YouTube comments, but I'll make a note and we can go back to it at the end, because I think now it's time to move on to the next presentation. Thank you very much, Jean-Marc. And we welcome now Professor Andrea Revesz, who is our next speaker. Whenever you're ready, Andrea, just start sharing your screen.
Can you see my screen? Brilliant. Well, yes. I do my best to keep you in the flow of what might seem like a less exciting topic, but my enthusiasm hopefully will get you going. So the title of the presentation is Investigating Second Language Writing Processes and the Roles of Proficiency and Stage of Writing. This was a joint project with several colleagues and former students, Maria Michel, Xiaojun Liu, Nectaria Kotali, Minjin Li, and Lois Borges, and it was funded by the Educational Testing Service. Whoops, yes. Let me start with the background. The last 3 decades have seen a significant advancement in describing and understanding second language writing processes. Much of the existing research has been cognitive in orientation and has been concerned with capturing online writing behaviors. These are the directly observable characteristics of writing, such as posing, and associated cognitive processes, including planning and linguistic encoding. For the purposes of this research, we adopted Kellogg's model of writing. This model describes writing in terms of 3 stages: formulation, execution, and monitoring. Planning includes planning the content and organization of the written piece, and then the message is translated into written form through translation processes such as lexical retrieval, syntactic encoding, and cohesion. Then execution follows when we actually turn these ideas into physical text. And then while we are doing this, we constantly reread, edit, and monitor our evolving text. All of these stages work in parallel. This is an interactive model. So the question is, how can we test this and other theoretical models of writing? So far, most of the research has relied on introspective methods, such as the think aloud and stimulated recall procedure. But probably due to limitations associated with these techniques, researchers increasingly use methods such as keystroke logging to record keystrokes and mouse movements of writers. When it comes to keystroke logging, however, we still can see where writers are looking on the screen if they type, and eye tracking can help deal with this limitation, which records a writer's eye fixations and saccades. These are the little jumps between our gazes. These three methods have rarely been used in combination so far. So our aim, one of our aims in this project, was to triangulate these sources to thoroughly tap the writing process. We were also interested in the role of proficiency and how it predicts writing processes. Based on Kellogg's model, we made the following predictions. Given that higher proficiency writers have more automatized linguistic skills, we expected that they would be more able to handle competing demands on planning, translation, and monitoring processes. In turn, we expected this would lead to increased speed fluency, faster writing, less frequent and shorter pauses, especially at low texture units, because we know from previous research that pauses at these units tend to be more related to lower level linguistic encoding processes, and also less local viewing behavior, assuming that if you're less proficient, maybe you have less attentional resources to move back in the text, reread what you've done, just because of time constraints and less advanced linguistic skills. So what we know from previous research that indeed it seems like that increased speed fluency is displayed by more proficient writers. The findings for pausing so far are mixed. And when it comes to viewing behaviors, the single study which looked at writing processes in relation to proficiency and used eye tracking found no effects for proficiency. In addition to proficiency, we also wanted to see how the stage of writing might affect this relationship. Stage of writing meaning what we do at the beginning of the writing process, what we do in the middle, and what we do towards the end. Based on Rocadelarius and colleagues' work, we expected that higher proficiency writers may be better able to decide which writing activities to focus on and what point during the writing process. What we know from previous research, indeed, what more proficient writers tend to do, they plan more in the beginning and they monitor their performance more towards the end. So there is a variation in terms of writing processes. In light of this, we expected that the more proficient writers are, in early and later writing stages, higher proficiency will lead to lower speed fluency, more frequent and longer pauses, and also less local viewing. So our research questions were as follows. To what extent does proficiency predict the speed fluency, pausing, and eye gaze behaviors of second language writers and pause-related cognitive processes? So our independent variable was proficiency, and our dependent variables were writing behaviors and associated cognitive processes. Our second research question was concerned with how writing stage might moderate this relationship. So depending on proficiency, would people display or would writers display differential behaviors at the beginning, in the middle, towards the end of the writing process? Moving on to methodology. Our participants were 60 Chinese second language users of English who altogether produced 240 writing performances. They were all international students at the University of London. They came from various levels of proficiency, CEFR C1, B2, and B1 levels. The mean age was 24, and the majority were female. We operationalized proficiency as participants combined reading and listening TOEFL score. What did they do? First, they completed the TOEFL IBT listening and reading components. Then they did a typing test. Then in individual tests, they produced 4 TOEFL IBT writing tests. While they were writing, we recorded their keystrokes and also their eye movements using input log and an iLink 1000 eye tracker. Out of the 4 writing tasks, 2 were integrated tasks and 2 were independent writing tasks. In this study, we only focused on the independent tasks. The independent task was an argumentative essay, and participants had 30 minutes to complete this essay. Then a stimulated recall session followed, which was based on the last writing task that participants performed. They watched the recording of their own writing performance while their keystroke logs and eye gaze recordings were available. They were also encouraged to stop the recording at any time they wanted to make a comment. And if they didn't do so, the researcher in addition stopped the recording and elicited their thoughts when they paused or revised their production. These were conducted in the participants' first language, Mandarin, by one of our colleagues. Here's one type of output the input log software generates. So the input log software can show you what the participants produced, what was kept, what was revised. You can also see the location of pauses, how long these pauses were. Here we have a pause of, in the first line, 7,348 milliseconds. It's about 7 seconds. We also have a record of the function keys which were used. In terms of pausing behaviors, we calculated the median length of pauses and also the frequency of pauses. And we also looked into how these measures differed according to pause location, whether they occurred within words, between words, or between sentences. This was important because from previous research we know that pausing at lower textual location tend to be more associated with lower level writing processes, such as lexical retrieval and syntactic encoding. When it comes to eye tracking, our interest area was the whole writing window. And then for the whole writing window, we extracted the following eye tracking indices for the full writing process and also the 5 stages of writing we defined. Total fixation count, total fixation time, median length of fixation, number of forward and backward saccades. Again, these are the jumps ahead or back in the text, how long these jumps were, the length of forward and backward saccades, and finally proportion of backward saccades, which would indicate whether participants moved forward or backwards more often in the text. When it comes to the stimulated recall comments, we used Kellogg's model as a basis for categorization. We categorized comments into planning, translation, and monitoring related processes. Here are a few examples. Here's an example for planning. I was thinking what to write for the second point. Organization. I was thinking I would write 2 paragraphs to support my view and write another paragraph starting with admittedly. Another for lexical retrieval. I was thinking what verb to use after 2. The words I used were very similar to those in the question. And then syntactic encoding. I was thinking of adding a clause after study the subject to express you're interested in. I didn't want to phrase it in the same way as the question did. Cohesion. I was wondering what linking word to use here. And finally, a comment, an example for monitoring. I was reading the sentence again to see whether it conveyed what I wanted to express. Before presenting the results to you, let me remind you of the first research question. This was concerned with the effects of proficiency on second language writing behaviors and associated cognitive processes. Our statistical analysis involved a series of multi-level mixed models for the writing behaviors. Our dependent variable was a measure of pausing or eye gaze behavior in each of these models. We had random effects, participants, and prompt, and the fixed effect was proficiency. When it comes to the stimulated recall comments, we ran a series of simple regression analyses. Our predictor was proficiency, and the dependent variable was the proportion of stimulated recall comments on planning, translation, or monitoring, again in each analysis. Out of the 18 writing behavior indices, proficiency emerged as a significant predictor for 3 measures: number of characters per p-burst, the number of characters produced between pauses, median pause lengths between words, and number of pauses between sentences. No proficiency effects emerged for any of the eye gaze behavior indices or for the stimulated recall comments. In particular, we observed the following patterns. More proficient writers wrote faster. They produced more characters per p-burst. They also produced shorter pauses between words, and they paused more frequently between sentences. Let me just show some of these findings for you visually as well. What you can see here, on the horizontal axis, we have proficiency. On the vertical axis, number of characters per p-burst. And what you can see, as proficiency increases, the slope is getting steeper. So as proficiency increases, as I said earlier, participants produce more characters per p-burst. This is the graph for median pause lengths between words. Here we can see the opposite trend. As proficiency increased, the median pause length decreased, and the effect size here was of median effect. And finally, the opposite trend was observed for pause frequency between sentences. As you can see, as proficiency increases, the number of pauses per minute also increases. Moving on to the second research question, remember this was concerned with how writing stage might moderate the relationship between proficiency and writing behaviors and processes. Our statistical analyses were exactly the same. The only difference was that in terms of fixed effects, we had proficiency, writing stage, and the interaction between proficiency and writing stage. And what we were interested in was the interaction effect, because this would indicate a difference when it comes to the relationship between writing stage and writing behaviors depending on proficiency. A proficiency stage interaction emerged as a significant predictor for 9 measures: characters per p-burst, active writing time, median pause length between words and in total, mean fixation length. And when it comes to the stimulated recall comments, we observed an interaction from planning-related comments and monitoring-related comments within words and in total. Specific trends were as follows. Again, more proficient writers wrote slower in the last stage of writing, and they also paused longer in later stages of writing. When it comes to the eye gaze data, they produced shorter mean fixations, again in later stages, and the stimulated recall comments revealed that there were more planning-related comments in earlier stages and more monitoring-related comments in later stages when it comes to more proficient writers. And let me just demonstrate one of these relationships. Here comes the data for characters per p-burst. Again, on the horizontal axis, you have proficiency. On the vertical axis, you have number of characters per p-burst, so how fast participants are writing. Each of these lines indicates a stage. What we found, there was a significant stage difference between stages 1 and 5, 2 and 5, 3 and 5, and 4 and 5. And as you can see, the orange line, which indicates stage 5, is not as steep as the previous line, which indicates previous stages. So what this graph shows is, as proficiency increased, participants displayed less speedy writing in stage 5, the last stage of the writing process, as compared to earlier stages. So let's discuss this finding. Just as a reminder, in relation to research question 1, we found that more proficient writers wrote faster, they produced shorter pauses, and paused more frequently between sentences. So how do these findings compare to our expectations? Indeed, as we expected, we did find increased speed fluency when it comes to more proficient writers. Of course, this is not a surprising finding. Proficiency, this was something that previous studies have also found. And it's also worth mentioning that proficiency had the strongest relationship to writing fluency, explaining 30% of the variance in terms of scores. When it comes to pausing, our findings are partially in line with our predictions. Like in Barkawi, as predicted, and also as we predicted, higher proficiency participants paused shorter at lower texture units, but contrary to our predictions and also Barkawi's research, high proficiency participants paused more often at sentence boundaries. One of the reasons for these findings could be that we had a lower pause threshold. As in previous studies, we have 200 milliseconds, and then in previous research, the pause threshold usually was 2 seconds. In terms of eye gaze behaviors, Well, we didn't really find any evidence for our expectations, but we did find some significant effects. Remember, we found that median pause length was longer in the later stages of writing. But when it comes to saccade length, we had no proficiency effects, and this was different from previous writing studies. Chukarov Hudlainen, for example, did find some effects for saccade length, but they looked at the difference between L1 and L2 writers, so this might account. This could be one of the reasons for the difference across these two studies. Also, we might have had two coarse ice measures, two coarse eye gaze measures. As I mentioned, we looked at the whole writing window, and we could have looked at smaller areas. I will get back to this later. What about stage of writing? Again, what we found, more proficient writers were faster, was longer in later stages. There were also shorter mean fixations in later stages. And when it comes to the stimulated recall comments, more planning in earlier stages and more monitoring in later stages of writing. So what these three data sources seem to tell us that more proficient writers engaged in less intensive text production and more monitoring in later stages of writing. What about these findings? Are they aligned with previous research? Indeed, in a way, yes, because Roca Delarius and colleagues predicted that when it comes to more proficient writers, they can be more strategic. There will be greater variation in writing processes, and indeed, this is what we found. More proficient writers spend more in the beginning, monitored more in later stages. Compared to previous research, however, we found no evidence that they engaged in more in linguistic encoding processes in the middle. So probably what we observed is higher proficiency writers plan all along the way, they monitor more in the end. And when it comes to less proficient writers, they just don't have time to monitor towards the end of the writing process. So what are the implications of our research? When it comes to practice, speed fluency served as a good proxy for proficiency. So maybe when it comes to testing, testing boards might integrate speed fluency as an indicator of writing proficiency when it comes to automated scoring procedures. So that could be one practical implication. In terms of pedagogy, maybe writers could be encouraged to change their strategies, do different things in the beginning and the ends, because it seems to be a more efficient method when it comes to more proficient writers. In terms of methodology, as in our previous research, again, we confirmed that triangulating data from these various data sources is useful, and it helps to gain complementary and also synergistic evidence about writing processes. It allows for tapping both explicit and implicit writing processes, and we will also be able to look at some reading while writing. But of course, this study has several limitations. So let me make you aware of these and also outline some next steps. We only focused on Chinese and second language writers, so future research might want to look at other first language groups as well to make sure that our findings are generalizable. We also had quite coarse eye gaze measures focusing on the whole writing window. Unfortunately, the font size was too small to look at more specific areas of interest in the platform we had. But of course, this led to limitations. It would have been much better to look at word level indices when it comes to eye gaze behavior. So hopefully in future research, more fine-grained indices can be used. We only looked at a single area of interest. It would have been interesting to look at instructions, the timer, and we might be able to do that we still have the data in future studies. And as I mentioned earlier, the 200 millisecond pause threshold is something that we allowed us to look at in more fine-grained way when it comes to linguistic encoding processes, but it decreases the comparability of our findings to previous research. So it would be interesting to see what a 2-second pause threshold would yield and how our findings would compare to previous research. And I think I'm going to stop here, and again, thanks ETS for financial support. Okay.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for a fantastic presentation. We have a few minutes now for questions or comments. I can start with a question. I was just wondering, I mean, in this study, you looked at proficiency and writing, a stage of writing. And I was wondering, you know, based on your experience in working, you know, in this context, I was wondering how much of these writing behaviors do you think could be explained by one's individual writing style, or you know, there might be people who like to revise more or less. I mean, I was just wondering what your thoughts were about these.
Well, first of all, it would be great to conduct this study. Of course, our study was a quantitative study, so what I'm going to share with you is just anecdotal evidence. But I do remember from the study that when it comes to initial plotting, there is quite a bit of variation. Some writers would plan and include all their, you know, the outline on the screen, and then we would keep that and sort of add and keep revising it through the writing process. Others would hardly do anything, but that might take a bit of time to write. And actually, when it comes to lower proficiency writers, those were the ones who would start writing much earlier, I think. So definitely there seems to be, I mean, again, it's all, we would need to do qualitative studies and follow this up. But our observations seem to be that more proficient writers took more time to plan in the beginning. But
excellent,
again,
thanks a lot.
Our, you know, more qualitative type of research would be and we have the data, so we could do that in the future.
No, that really sounds fascinating. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. I think there is, yeah, I can see a hand. Parvaneh?
Yes, Andrea, thank you. That was a fascinating study, and I am very pleased to see the results, because they seem to me to be similar to what we have found in speaking. I have a clarification question. You are reporting that higher proficiency writers paused longer. Is it longer or more frequently between sentences?
Not longer, it was only more frequently.
More frequent.
Rising.
Okay.
I totally, I mean, probably that's why you're asking. And we were thinking that probably it had to do with the low post threshold, because when it comes to less proficient writers, we're thinking that maybe they pause longer, and this might have inflated our results a bit. So what might have happened that we might have picked up some of the pauses for higher, so we picked up more pauses for higher proficiency writers in this way. But,
okay, all right, but that's interesting, because I think, again, that is a way of distinguishing lower level learners from higher level learners. You know, probably low proficiency writers plan more in the middle of sentences, whereas, you know, high proficiency learners do that at the beginning of the next sentence or at the end of the existing sentence. So I thought that was a very interesting finding. Thank you.
Thank you.
Victoria, go ahead.
I just, thank you, Andrea, for the very interesting presentation. I just have a question, sort of out of curiosity, almost like continuing the conversation, in terms of comparing writing behavior in your first language and in your second language. So whether those kind of almost like literacy practices, whether they are transferable from one language to another. So whether you think there's a link between the way you write in your first language and whether that would make you less efficient or a more efficient writer in your second language.
I mean, it wasn't part of our study, but from previous research, we know that if you're a better writer in your first language after, you know, there is this linguistic threshold hypothesis, it was called, you know, from the Canadian context, where they say the prediction is if you reach a certain level of proficiency, then you can transfer from your writing skills into the R2. So that definitely helps. And again, from previous studies, we also know that when which aligns with our findings, that native speakers tend to pause more as compared to second language writers. So there are a few studies when we had both first, not we, but other studies, first and second language data. And writers in their first language tend to pause more between sentences and less within lower texture units, which is again very well aligned with the speaking data, and that's what we would expect, because when it comes to lower texture units, probably they are more involved with linguistic encoding processes, looking for the right word, thinking about grammar, so not thinking so much about what to say, but about how to say it or how to write it.
Thank you so much. I just, it's a sort of almost out of curiosity and sort of an extension to what you presented. Thank you.
Thank you.
Peter, I think you had your hand out.
Oh, thank you. Yes. Can I check? Well, thank you, Andrea. Can I check, when you were talking about proficiency, was that determined by the IBT scores?
Yes, and we thought so much about this. Thanks for raising this question, because actually we had quite a comprehensive proficiency measure, because we had the writing, listening, and reading components. And originally we were thinking of using the writing component as a predictor, but then it becomes circular, our reasoning. But having reading and listening, it's not entirely perfect either, because as we know, actually we had strong relationship among the various measures, but we're looking at different predictors of proficiency. It's not the same scale, and we didn't have an overall measure because we couldn't administer the speaking test. So what we did is the listening and reading component of the TOEFL IBT.
Right. Well, yes, and so not so much a question as an observation. As you were speaking about the things that the writers were doing, it kind of reminded me a lot of the expertise literature, which I think is an interesting literature in general about how experts are different from novices. And so you could actually distinguish between level of expertise in writing and general proficiency, so that you might, and often they come together. Highly proficient people are also have expertise. But the features of what they did that you were talking about strike me as the sort of things that experts would do. They seem to spend time at the beginning and exploit what they'd done at the beginning. And that can't have involved a huge amount of mechanics of writing, but it was clarifying how they would approach the task. And so I wondered if that might be a sort of related literature that could be illuminating. One of the things that you read in that literature is the contrast between breadth and depth. And experts in doing something handle the tension between breadth and depth. You've got to handle both, but they handle at the beginning how you move from one to the other and how you avoid too much depth in one area without having considered breadth and so on. So I wondered if there were, useful things to find there. That was just an observation.
I totally agree, and it's really interesting. I think one thing, getting back to Victoria's question, a weakness of our study that we don't have a first language baseline, because we don't know what their expertise is in L1 writing. But it was quite a homogeneous group. They were, IELTS in terms of Chinese students studying at a university, but we don't know. So to some extent, maybe the expertise, we could learn at least about their writing expertise in general, looking at the L1 baseline data. But that's interesting.
And finally, we have very quickly a question from our YouTube comments. So Andrea, you've looked at speed, fluency, and pausing in the study, but have you also looked at repair-related features?
Hi, Aki. Nice to have you. Aki was one of our MA students in the program, and now she's a PhD student at Concordia University. So very nice that she's still back. We did look at revision. I didn't talk about this in this study, but we also looked at revision behaviors. And I don't know we didn't consider proficiency in relation to revision behaviors that yet. But we have the data, so that's something that we're planning to do in the future. Thanks for the question.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much again for the presentation. Thanks a lot, Andrea. And now we're going to move on to our third presentation today. Professor Tavakoli, whenever you're ready, feel free to start sharing your screen. And unmute yourself.
Is this okay now? All right. Hello, everyone. The talk I'm presenting here today is on behalf of our research team, my colleagues, Dr. Fumi Nakatsuhara and Dr. Anas Awad. I would also like to say that the project was funded by the British Council Assessment Research Awards. Okay, to provide you with a background to the study, I would like to start talking about the importance of fluency in assessing the speaking ability. As you probably know, fluency has been one of the key characteristics of the spoken performance that has been continuously assessed by different language testing organizations since the 1930s in the United States of America. It is assessed quite variedly in different tests. For example, IELTS considers fluency in relation to coherence. If you look at Trinity, you would see Trinity College London test, you would see that fluency is assessed as part of delivery in addition to pronunciation. For TOEFL, IBT, on the one hand, they look at pronunciation when they assess fluency, and on the other hand, they look at accuracy and complexity. And in Pearson Test of English for Academic Purposes, fluency has got an independent construct called fluency. This was also reflected by DeYoung in her 2018 publication, and she gives many examples of how fluency is assessed. Also, research in language testing has provided evidence that fluency criterion is usually the most difficult to assess. There are a range of different understanding and perceptions and definitions of fluency, and that makes it a construct that is difficult to assess. Also, research has shown that fluency is affected by the elicitation task and by its characteristics. And in fact, it is the most susceptible feature to those features of task. If we look at second language acquisition, we would see that over the past couple of decades, fluency has been defined in a more systematic way. For example, Segalowitz defines fluency in terms of three interrelated aspects of it. So cognitive fluency, that refers to the ease or difficulty of the cognitive processes underlying the speech production process. Utterance fluency, which refers to the observable features of speech, and then perceived fluency that indicates how listeners or raters perceive someone's speech. The focus of our study was on utterance fluency because this is something observable, something tangible, and something that language testing organizations frequently refer to. To define utterance fluency, Skin 2003 and Tavakoli and Skin 2005 examine fluency in terms of how much silence is there, how fast it is produced, language is produced, and how much repair can be seen. So we try to adopt a second language acquisition perspective to examining fluency. And so far I have been involved in 3 different studies that look at fluency across assessed levels of proficiency. In the first and second study, we looked at the Aptis speaking paper, and we looked at A2 to C1 levels of proficiency. In another totally different study, we looked at the TEEP, Test of English for Educational Purposes at the University of Reading, and we looked at proficiency and fluency of speech across levels of proficiency. What I'm going to present here today is based on Nakatsuhara et al. 2019, but before presenting the results of the study, I need to show you what we found in those previous studies that encouraged us to move to this examination of fluency. So what we found in Aptis was that with speed fluency, speed develops across proficiency levels, but only up to a certain extent. So if we look at the speed, whether in terms of speech rate or articulation rate, we can see that A2, B1, and B2 levels are distinguished, but B2 and C1 level are not statistically in a significant way different. If we look at length of pause, we noticed that A2 level, lower proficiency groups, are different from the rest. Therefore, length of pause can be a very good way of distinguishing very low proficiency speakers from others. Looking at frequency of mid-clause pauses, we found that the lower groups of A2 and B1 were different from B2 and C1. But again, we noticed that B2 and C1 levels of proficiency were not different in terms of frequency of mid-clause pauses. And in terms of field pauses, we couldn't find a systematic pattern of field pauses across these levels of proficiency. Therefore, we can say that field pauses cannot inform rating descriptors or rating scales in a clear manner. I also need to say that these findings were replicated when we looked into the TEEP test. So we know that some of these features, so to summarize it, we know that some of the fluency characteristics of speech can be used as criterial features of A2 level, B1 level, or B2 level. But when it comes to higher levels of proficiency, it is very difficult to see how these two levels are different. So we hypothesized that lack of a differentiation between these two levels, B2 and C1, could indicate a ceiling effect. We may suggest that learners develop their speed up to a certain level and then they stop. Or it might be due to the fact that there wasn't a suitable task in these tests. So maybe if we give the learners a suitable task, they may perform differently. Also, it is possible to hypothesize that other linguistic features of speech encourage raters to rate these people in two different groups. So these concerns and questions encouraged us with the second study. Our main question was what distinguishes B2 and C1 levels. We aimed to develop a better understanding of fluency and its relationship to other aspects of performance. We wanted to see whether these aspects of performance had any relationship with one another. And also we wanted to bring in a new analysis, a new approach to analyzing speech. In a way, we wanted to create a triangulation of our analysis, and we used a discourse analysis approach to looking into how pauses worked in the speech of B2 and C1 level candidates. So these are our research questions. Are there any differences in how B2 and C1 candidates demonstrate their proficiency in terms of grammatical range, accuracy, vocabulary, and cohesion? Do these properties correlate with one another and correlate with fluency features that were identified in the previous study? And are there any differences between B2 and C1 candidates in the way they use pauses or they pause? The data comes from 16 candidates at these two levels. Their speaking performance in an argumentative monologic task was examined, and we employed a two-phase explanatory sequential mixed methods. We looked at it quantitatively in research questions 1 and 2, and qualitatively at research question 3. Research question 1 and 2 looked at accuracy, fluency, complexity, and cohesion, plus vocabulary, and it recruited t-tests and correlations. And with research question 3, we use qualitative analysis of pauses in their context, and we focused on pauses that were about 1 second or longer. This is a visual representation of what we did during the data coding and data analysis. We used a range of measures of analysis. For grammatical range, we followed Norris and Ortega 2009, and we used frequency-based, subordination-based, and length-based measures. We also looked at number of verb elements in AS units. For accuracy, we followed Foster and Wigglesworth and used weighted clause ratio. Also looked at number of errors per 100 words. For vocabulary, we looked at lexical sophistication, density, and diversity, as well as lexical errors, and we used vocab profile and text inspector. For cohesion, again, we used text inspector and looked at types and tokens of meta-discourse markers, and we looked into a range of meta-discourse markers that are identified by text inspector. Our qualitative analysis, we used a discourse analysis approach. This approach is suggested by Seedhouse and Nakatsuhara. It is conversation analysis informed, but it is not a conversation analysis approach. It takes a more systematic approach to analyzing discourse. It investigates and describes talk in interaction. It follows the principles of unmotivated looking, and therefore we looked at everything that could provide us with evidence of why the learners, the speakers are pausing. And it takes a systematic and transparent approach. Finally, it triangulates this interaction with this analysis with the linguistic analysis that we have done. It followed 2 phases. In phase 1, we prepared the transcripts, and in phase 2, we identified the emerging patterns. The 3 of us did the discourse analysis independently of one another, but eventually we put the themes that we had come up with together and developed a scheme for it. This is how our transcripts with annotations looked. And the lexical analysis conducted in vocab profile, the meta-discourse analysis conducted in text inspector, and now quantitative results. We ran a number of t-tests for all measures of complexity, accuracy, vocabulary, and meta-discourse. Bear in mind that for fluency, there were no statistically significant differences between B2 and C1 level. The results that you can see here are the significant results obtained from this analysis. As you can see, the only significant results are for measures of accuracy and lexical diversity. In other words, the B2 and C1 levels were only different in terms of their accuracy and lexical diversity. They weren't different in terms of vocabulary, meta-discourse, or complexity, and they weren't initially different in terms of fluency. A word of warning here, this is a very small sample. We're talking about a very small sample, and therefore caution should be taken. As you can see, the significant results were associated with relatively large effect sizes. In terms of correlations, we found several correlations between measures of complexity, accuracy, lexis, and meta-discourse on one hand and fluency on the other hand. Many of these correlations are nothing new, things that we already knew, but they were confirming what we have already known in the field. There were some interesting patterns emerging. For example, length of clause negatively correlated with speed and positively with repair measures. We found that for lexical complexity, for example, the positively correlated with speed measures and negatively with errors. One measure of lexical sophistication, K3 words, correlated positively with mid-clause pauses. Again, this is something interesting, something we already knew, that when we use sophisticated words, sophisticated language, pauses are longer. With meta-discourse markers, it was interesting because both meta-discourse type and token positively correlated with speed measures and with end of clause pauses. I would also like to say that significant correlations ranged from 0.53 to 0.88. The qualitative results provided us with three main categories of pauses: pauses related to access and retrieval, pauses related to reformulation, and pauses related to effective speech delivery. So, for example, as I said before, this is something that we already knew based on the literature, that mid-clause pauses for lexical and structural search and also sophisticated language were all identified with access and retrieval. We had mid-clause pauses for lexical and structural search, but these resulted in errors. They weren't successful. Pauses after sophisticated use of language, pauses for recalling items from long-term memory, pauses for reformulation or for rescuing language, topic development, attracting listener attention. And that was another interesting finding. For example, when they used an intensifier, they usually paused longer, and end clause pauses before topic shift. And when they were expressing this preference, we could see, again, more pauses. I'm going to give you examples. This is an example of mid-clause pause for lexical or structural search. Here, the speaker is trying to give a more sophisticated language, uses an expression that seems to be a bit more sophisticated, fortify this emotion, and they pause in the middle, recalling items from long-term memory. For topic development, the speaker has said something, but they feel the need that they need to develop this, they need to say more, and we have observed quite a number of pauses for this reason. Long pauses after an intensifier. It is very intense, and then it was so amazing. End clause pauses before topic shift. Turn initial pauses before dispreferred response, expressing this preference, especially at initial pause, at initial position, was associated with long pauses. Okay, to summarize, so we now know that the B2 and C1 levels are not different in terms of their fluency, syntactic complexity, meta-discourse markers used, and many measures of vocabulary. However, they are different in terms of accuracy and lexical diversity, and perhaps these differences encourage raters to place speakers at different levels of proficiency. With correlations, now we know that the longer the AS units, the more end clause pauses. Language that is lexically more diverse, it is quicker. And lexically more diverse language is also associated with more and longer mid-clause pauses. We also learn from the correlations that efficient use of meta-discourse markers is linked with speedy performance. So in terms of discourse analysis, we found the discourse analysis a very useful approach in order to understand, to develop a more in-depth understanding of fluency behavior. The results also suggested that our pauses are linked to formulation stage, conceptualization stage, but also linked to more effective use of language. In terms of the findings, we can say that perhaps there is a ceiling effect for syntactic complexity and for fluency, but accuracy and lexical diversity develops beyond B2 level. We still don't know whether task design might have had an impact, and that's something that future studies will need to look into. We have also shown that there is a complex relationship between these different aspects of performance, and we now know that there are certain measures of analysis that can help distinguish between levels, but there is a lot that rating scales draw on, but they don't really distinguish different levels of proficiency. These are some of the references, and I would like to thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for your presentation.
Okay.
We have a few minutes for questions now. Questions or comments? Andrea, I can see your hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Parvaneh, for this really interesting talk. It's a fascinating study, and I especially like the qualitative analysis. I think that's quite new and really interesting in this area of research. just two questions. If I remember correctly, you said that your pause threshold was 1 second, and normally in speaking research, it tends to be, as far as I'm familiar with it, 250 seconds, right? That seems like the norm. So why did you go for a longer pause threshold?
Well, don't forget, Andrea, that the first study has looked at pauses longer than 200 milliseconds.
Okay.
So we had already looked at those pauses, and those analyses suggested that these two levels were not different. So in the second study, when we decided to look at it from a qualitative perspective, we thought we need to look into longer pauses that sort of can help us understand what's happening. With the micro level pauses, we have already seen that there weren't that much difference.
I see. Okay, so you've got us there. And the second question, just very quickly, it's a very practical one. Why did you use Text Inspector for? Because normally co-metrics, or why did you decide to go with?
We found Text Inspector very useful in terms of meta discourse markers. Co-metrics is very useful for a range of different linguistic items, but not in terms of meta-discourse markers. That was the reason. And also, I think for the research team, we were experimenting with text inspectors, so we wanted to see how it works. Are you familiar with meta-discourse markers in co-metrics?
Not, I mean, I use co-metrics, but I don't remember the details. Anyway, I ask you later. I want to give time as well.
All right.
Pauline?
Hi, Parvaneh.
Hi, Pauline.
Thanks so much for that. It's very, very interesting. I've got two things, if I may. One slightly, I want you to clarify a slide. Just very briefly, it's your first slide where you report the quantitative results.
Okay.
And where you're distinguishing on, you were sort of saying the measures which were significantly different on your t-test between B2 and C1.
Yes.
You know that one there?
Yes. Do you want to have a look?
Well, it might help the others.
Okay, let me.
It just struck me looking at that. Well, firstly, it's really great that you've got some interesting outcomes, albeit from a few people.
Okay.
And I understood you got two clearly distinct accuracy between B2 and C1. The accuracy of the performance was, so it's not that, it's the not those, it's the results.
Oh,
you've got a sort of stripy slide. Keep going. Oh, stop right there.
Okay.
Weighted clause ratio.
Yes.
You've got 2 readings for C1.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think that's an error, Pauline. I cut and pasted from a very longer table, and I just noticed that here. So ignore that. The second reading.
Okay, well, then I just, get a brownie.
I'm sorry, I just
point
noticed
for
it as I was
spotting it.
presenting.
Yes. Yeah. So I understand. Yeah. So that's great, because the numbers, not only are there 2 readings for one, but one of them is an extraordinarily impossible number. Yeah. So but I think it's really good to see that the mean of 0.86 and the mean of 0.92 are quite far apart on that measure, and it's excellent to see that it's working for you in terms of the probability of that difference. So that's really very nice to see. So thank you for that. You have a comment in, if someone is asked if the accuracy measure includes pronunciation, and I can quickly nip in here and say no, it doesn't. It's entirely to do with morphosyntax.
Yes.
So here is my very little other tiny thing, which struck me from when you said that the A2 level is not proficient enough to use filled pauses. So very briefly, though, here, because I know this could go on for a long time, but I've always been intrigued as to why anybody would need any level of proficiency to fill a pause. It seems to me that you could have practically zero proficiency, but know how to fill a pause, because it doesn't require knowledge, does it, to fill a pause? So why is that anything that we talk about?
As far as I know, and it's not only based on this study, based on a range of studies that we have done with L1 speakers, the use of field pauses, Pauline, is also L1 related and culturally related. So we are here talking about test takers from a range of different backgrounds, and we didn't see effective use of field pauses. They had, with this A2 level, they had very long silent pauses. And it seemed to us that either it was linguistic related, or they weren't at a level that could provide those field pauses in order to buy time.
Yeah.
So they said something, and then there was a long silent pause, and then they started saying something else.
So maybe what's going on there is that a pause can only be filled really when it's a short one, right? If it's going to be a short one, and you're going to say or you're only going to buy yourself a little microscopic amount of time, but you can fill it nevertheless. But if you've got a long think coming because you don't know what to say next, there's no filling
that could
possible.
Probably be another very good explanation.
Okay.
But it was quite striking to us that they didn't use field pauses. And again, I didn't want to discuss that here because of relevance, but it was interesting that B1 and C1 level used a lot more field pauses than B2 level.
Yeah.
But we already knew that B2 level were very active at monitoring their language. So they all might be interrelated.
Exactly. Yeah.
But we can discuss it further.
Over tea somewhere. Yes. Okay. Thanks, Parvaneh.
Okay.
We have a few questions from the audience. I mean, we are in the break time, but maybe we can use this time to answer these questions if you don't mind, Parvaneh.
Yes, sure.
So we have a question from Takumi Uchihara. Hi, Takumi.
Hi, Takumi.
He's saying, thank you for sharing the great study. A bit surprising that lexical measures such lexical diversity distinguish the two levels. I wondered whether the results were influenced by the descriptors that raters used, or any thoughts about that?
So the fact that the two groups were different in terms of their lexical diversity may not be something applicable to all performances, I can say. On this particular performance, on this particular task, these were different. But Takumi is right. It might be related to the way the raters are rating these pieces of performance. I haven't seen anything in the Aptis rating of fluency that suggests they should give a higher ranking to more lexical diversity. But I think that's a very good topic for investigation, Takumi.
We do have another question from Benio Suzuki. Thank you for the presentation. Do you think lexical diversity influences use of interaction repertoires?
I think lexical diversity is perhaps linked to a range of different characteristics of not only the speech task, but also the speaker themselves. I think perhaps we can even look at personality and lexical diversity. I don't know the answer to that question, based on the data that we have or the data analysis that we have done. But I guess there might be a relationship.
Great, thanks. And maybe the last, we have time for one more
Could
question.
I ask a just a quick comment? That in the past I have checked, and it seems that typically introverts produce higher lexical diversity than extroverts, because they want to find the really lovely, difficult word, whereas the extroverts want to go fast.
Interesting, very interesting, Jean-Marc. Thank you.
And so we have a question from Shungo Suzuki about the example of a mid-clause pause before a lexically sophisticated word, 45, considering the possibility that lexically sophisticated words are also conceptually sophisticated, then I wonder how we can distinguish these two possible scenarios of breakdowns within clauses.
Exactly, Shongo. Thank you. This is a very good point. Absolutely. Even when we were analyzing the data, we had this comment that, you know, using a more sophisticated language can be linked to both items that you have mentioned. Yeah, so you're right.
And let me see if there is anything else in here. So we have one more question from the audience. Thank you very much for the interesting talk. Very quick question. Why did you go for a t-test for the first research question instead of maybe a non-parametric test, given the relatively small sample size?
We thought, we tried the non-parametric tests and we obtained very similar results, but we decided that a t-test would probably be a better option with a word of warning. And I made the word of warning that, you know, these results need to be taken into account with care and caution, because the sample size is really small.
Excellent. I think that's it. Any other final question? We have 1 minute left. Any comments or questions before we move on? Okay, if not, just thank you very much, Parvaneh, for an excellent presentation. Thanks a lot. And we'll now move on to our next presentation by me. So I'll do the introduction. Let me just start. Can you see the slide? Yep. Okay, excellent. Let me check the time. Yeah, okay, so let's get started. Hello, everyone. I'm Pellicer-Sanchez from the UCL Institute of Education. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about eye movements in vocabulary learning from reading. As you know, in the last decade, we've seen an increase in the number of studies actually using eye tracking to explore the process of vocabulary learning from reading. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is to provide a sort of brief overview of what these studies have shown so far, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more at the end about a recent study that I conducted in this area. So, as we all know, eye tracking has been predominantly used in cognitive psychology and psycholinguistics. And it's based on the idea that the eye is a window to the mind. And from the very beginning, it was considered as an opportunity to look into the mind of the subject. It's based on two main assumptions: that the amount of time spent fixating an item reflects the cognitive effort that is required to process it, and that what we are fixating is what we are actually considering. There are many benefits in using eye tracking, as we all know. It allows for a more natural processing, so there is no need to perform a secondary task, as it's the case of, for example, a button press in self-paced reading tasks. It provides a very rich record of online processing of different types of stimuli, so we can record what participants, what learners, how they're processing text, for example, or text in combination with audio, or static and dynamic images and multimodal stimuli. And I think for SLA researchers and vocabulary researchers, it's also one of the benefits is that it allows us to explore this connection between processing behavior, processing patterns, and vocabulary gains, outcome measures. So as I was saying, in the last decade, there has been an increase in the number of studies using eye tracking to explore vocabulary learning, with a particular focus on reading. There have been some studies in other contexts, but I would say the majority have focused on the examination of vocabulary learning from reading. And quite a few interesting and consistent patterns have emerged from this research. First of all, we've seen longer reading times for unknown vocabulary. So we've seen that when learners are reading a text and they encounter words that they don't know, we see longer reading times for that unknown vocabulary. But interestingly, we've seen that fixation duration and fixation count also decrease with subsequent exposures. So with more exposures, the processing and the reading of unknown vocabulary actually becomes more fluent and more automatic. And we've also seen that factors such as context, predictability, and order of acquisition also seem to affect eye movements and reading times. It's interesting because this pattern of increased attention, the first time we see learners see an unknown word in a text, and then this significant decrease in reading times and fixations with more exposures, seems to be a pretty robust finding. We've seen the same pattern in studies that have used different types of text. We've also seen the similar pattern in studies that have used different types of items. So we have some of these studies that I've mentioned with using pseudo words. Other studies use foreign language words, low frequency real words, and more recently we've seen the similar pattern in studies looking at the processing and learning of items beyond the single word. So looking at collocations and even binomials in some recent studies. So this seems to be a pretty robust finding. We all know as well that an important concern in the vocabulary learning from reading literature is this idea of the salience of target vocabulary. We know that incidental vocabulary learning depends on the degree of involvement in processing unknown words. And we know that learners need to notice the lexical items in the input. But we also know, as some researchers have claimed, that learners do not always notice unknown items in the input. So an important question in this context has been, what can we do to actually help learners notice the linguistic forms in the input? We know that there are many different methods for increasing salience of target vocabulary have been explored. Probably the most frequently examined method is pre-modification of input. So input enhancement techniques such as bolding, underlining, highlighting, well, studies have shown that they seem to support vocabulary learning from reading. And a couple of studies have also used eye tracking to explore how input enhancement techniques actually affect the processing of new vocabulary in reading. And a couple of studies have shown that input enhancement techniques actually lead to increased attention. So they lead to more fixations and longer fixations. And we've seen this pattern in studies with collocations in bold, a study by Choi, and another study with binomials presented in red. So in general, we see that input enhancement seem to lead to more attention, more fixations, and longer fixations. And another method that has been explored in the area as well is instructional intervention before reading. And we're all very familiar with this kind of technique. Often before the reading of a text, when we know that there are some difficult or challenging words in the text, we often present that vocabulary before the reading. We teach that set of words before learners encounter them in the text. So in a recent study, I used eye tracking to explore how this pre-reading instruction actually affected the processing of those words when encountered in a reading text. And surprisingly, we found that there was no evidence in the eye movements that pre-reading instruction actually led to more or less initial attention. So basically, it didn't matter if learners had received instruction on a set of words, because when they encountered them for the first time in the text, they actually read it in the same way. It didn't matter whether they had received instruction on those words before or not. They were read in a very similar way. We did find evidence for a processing advantage of pre-reading instructions. So later in the process, with subsequent exposures, when learners encountered those words later on in the text, we started to see a processing advantage for pre-reading instruction. But this didn't really happen at the first encounter. So when learners saw those words the very first time in the text, it didn't matter that they actually had received instruction before the reading. They were processed in the same way, and that was interesting and that was surprising. So we followed that up with another analysis in which we controlled for frequency of exposure, as that was because of the design of the initial study that could have been potentially a confounding factor. And what we found was that when we controlled for frequency of exposure, actually pre-reading instructions seemed to lead to increased attention. So of course we need more research in this area, but based on on this study so far, we see that these methods to increase the salience of target vocabulary, input enhancement techniques, and potentially pre-reading instruction as well, seem to lead to more attention and more and longer fixations on target and on vocabulary. And as I was saying at the beginning, an important concern of vocabulary researchers in this area has been to, and this is something that most of the studies that I've mentioned so far have actually looked at, we're interested in exploring this connection between the processing of the words in the text when learners encounter them and gains and vocabulary scores, right? So in a few of the studies that I've mentioned, researchers have found that longer processing times are related to higher scores. So increased attention leads to improved learning, and that makes sense. That supports the need for noticing and attention and for learning to take place. But of course, the story is never that simple. So we have other studies that have looked at this same relationship and have found no relationship between reading times and vocabulary scores. And this is not only in the reading context, we also have studies in vocabulary learning from multimedia exposure that have also found this lack of relationship. So what we have here is, well, basically longer reading times can be a reflection of different underlying processes. So it could be a reflection of more careful reading. So increased attention might be an attempt to learn those words that they are encountering, but it could also be a sign of processing difficulties, of increased cognitive effort. So researchers have started to argue for the need to have more fine-grained analysis of eye movement data, the need to isolate and identify these different sub-processes. And because the studies so far, the available studies haven't really been able to show a clear link between eye movement measures and the processes or outcomes of learning. So one method that researchers have suggested is this triangulation of data between eye movements, performance measures, and also stimulated recalls or post-treatment interviews. And this is something we've seen a good example of this triangulation of data in Andrea's presentation earlier today. So some of this triangulation is already happening in the context of writing and also testing. In the field of vocabulary learning, the study by Godfroyd and Smith in 2013 was an initial attempt to do this. And in fact, by triangulating this data, they were able to show that words for which participants could remember having read them in context were actually fixated longer and they were better learned. So following this line of research, I conducted this very exploratory study to really try to examine possible factors that could explain fixation duration patterns in vocabulary learning, and really to find out whether interview data could shed light into some of these factors. The study was conducted with 17 advanced speakers of English. They were asked to read a text which contained some pseudo words that were new for everyone. Their eye movements were recorded while they were reading this text. And after the reading, they completed a comprehension test and a vocabulary test to measure their knowledge and the learning of those words. And then they took part in an interview. So after the reading, they completed a vocabulary test, as I was saying, a meaning recall test. And then in the post-reading interview, we looked at different factors. First of all, we looked at perceived item difficulty. As we know that processing times could be affected by the difficulty of the items, as I was saying earlier. So we looked at this perceived item difficulty. We asked participants to rate the difficulty of each of the target words that appear in the text. We also measured their inferencing ability. We know that this is important, and successful vocabulary learning really depends on the ability to infer from context. So we showed them the text again with the words, and we asked them to try to infer the meaning of those words from context. I know that this is not exactly what they did while they were reading, or not necessarily the same, but at least that gave us an indication of their ability to infer from context. We also asked them about the noticing of the target items, if they had noticed those words or not. We also asked them to rate the difficulty of the overall text. So it could be hypothesized that obviously more difficult texts or texts that are perceived as more difficult could actually lead to longer reading times as well. And finally, we looked at the strategies that they use to deal with those unknown items that they encounter in the text. So we asked them what kind of strategies they were using when dealing with those unknown words. So in terms of the analysis, I'm only reporting here analysis with one of the eye movement measures, the sum total reading time. So basically, we look at the total time that participants spent processing those target words, each of the target words in the text. Then we conducted some correlation analysis to explore the relationship between the sum total reading time and lexical and learner factors, as you have here. And then finally, we did a bit more qualitative analysis of other interview factors, such as noticing overall text difficulty and strategy use. So in terms of the results, when we look at the relationship between sum total reading times and length, frequency, item difficulty, vocabulary learning scores, and inferencing, what we found was that frequency was significantly related to sum total reading times, and that's expected. More times appearing in the text actually led to longer processing, longer reading times. Vocabulary learning scores also significantly correlated with sum total reading times. And this was interesting because this confirmed what we had seen in, not in all previous studies, but in some previous studies, this connection between processing time, so more attention with higher vocabulary learning scores. We ran multiple regression analysis as well to see whether these factors predicted sum total reading times, and the pattern was exactly the same. So then we look at the noticing of the target items. Most participants said that they had actually noticed the unknown words. Interestingly, none of them said that they thought they were the focus of the study. And this is important because this is a common limitation of these type of studies, that you know, the unknown vocabulary becomes maybe too salient, and participants might think that that's the focus of the study. But surprisingly, none of them said that they thought this was the focus of the study. Interestingly, one participant said that she hadn't noticed the unknown items at all. So we looked, what we did was to compare these responses with the eye movement data. And in particular, we pay attention to what happened with this participant. And even though the average sum total reading time was shorter than in the other participants, actually that was still quite longer than the average fixation duration. So, I mean, those words, even though the participants said that she hadn't noticed those words, they were actually processed and they were read. It was interesting because there was no target words for this person had actually been skipped. And I think this is interesting because it shows the complexity in relating reading times and skipping rate with reported noticing and attention. And I'll come back to that in a minute. We also look, as I was saying, at overall text difficulty. We were predicting that increased perceived difficulty could slow down reading times on the text. So we would be expecting a sort of linear increase in reading times with increased difficulty. So more difficult or more perceived as more difficult texts would lead to longer reading times, but that was actually not what we found. We found no clear pattern, so there was no clear relationship between overall text difficulty and reading times. And finally, we looked at strategy use. So looking at the interview data, there were three main patterns that emerged in terms of strategies that people use. Skipping, ignoring unknown words was one, guessing from context, and then a combination of guessing and skipping. So some people said that they had ignored the unknown vocabulary. They said that they continued reading, then I just skipped and ignored them. There was no point in going back and checking the words. The point was enjoying reading. So that was a common strategy. Other participants said that they had tried to guess from context, so try to understand the meaning in the context, or read the previous sentences to try to guess the meaning. So as we know, this is a common strategy, of course, in learning from reading. And some participants said that they had used a combination. So sometimes guessing, a bit of skipping, so combining these two. So when we then looked at the strategies reported by each person and eye movement patterns. And again, it wasn't, the reported reading strategies were not clearly reflected in the eye movement data. So for example, when participants had reported that they had tried to guess from context, yes, in some cases we could see that participants had looked at contextual cues and had gone back and reread, the unknown items, but that wasn't always the case. It wasn't something very consistent, this link. And in terms of skipping, even though almost 70% of the participants said that they had skipped words at some point, actually the skipping rate when looking at eye movements was very, very low. So most of the words were read and processed, and only 5 cases out of 341 were actually skipped. So what we see here with this initial exploratory study was that, well, we see that vocabulary learning scores and frequency were significant predictors of some total reading time. They explained a very small amount of the variance in reading time, so that means that there are many other factors that are explaining and should explain eye movement behavior. We've seen that length, item difficulty, and inferencing ability didn't seem to explain total reading time in this study. Same with overall text difficulty. It was impossible to see a clear pattern in terms of text difficulty. And importantly, I think in terms of both the noticing and the strategy use, we've seen this discrepancy between reported information in the interviews and the eye movement patterns. And I think this confirms that eye movements tap into much more unconscious processes. And I think it also, of course, confirms the need to look at strategies and processes per individual word and see what happens with each individual word. And of course, I think in order to look to address this discrepancy, it would be good to use a stimulated recall interviews with video as a stimulus. We kind of avoided that in this first exploratory study because stimulated recall, so using video as a prompt, has been said to have limitations in the sense that it might force learners to verbalize processes that are unconscious, but that's something that it might be the only way really to tap into these different sub-processes. So of course, we need to do further analysis with this data, looking at more participants, other tests, and other eye movement measures. Future studies should also look at texts that include more repetition of items, because in this case, the words were only repeated a maximum of 3 times. We also need to look at other vocabulary tests as well, so looking at different components. And I think an important point is that so far in this research, we've looked at the processing of the words that participants don't know. I think we also need to pay more attention to the reading of the contextual cues and how people process those cues in the context. But above all, I think this shows that in order to explore this connection between processing and vocabulary gains, we really need to continue this line of research and continue triangulating data, not only from eye movements and performance measures, vocabulary tests, but also stimulated recalls and post-treatment interviews. And I think that's everything I wanted to say today. Yeah, thank you very much for your attention. And there should be a few minutes for questions. Any questions or comments? Andrea, I can see your hand up.
Maybe you didn't conduct this analysis, but first of all, great presentation. It was lovely to see all the summary and the new study. I really enjoyed it. I was wondering, thinking of Ron Liao's work and the depth of processing hypotheses and how this relates to learning. Based on the data, do you think that the interview data or the eye tracking data were better predictors of learning?
I think this is so, yeah, it's the question that I keep asking myself. I think both in combination are probably a better predictor of learning. What happens is that I think sometimes eye movements can be a good predictor of learning, but not always, because I think, as I was saying, eye movements are really a reflection of unconscious processes. So, but we know that when learners are learning from reading, sometimes they can adopt a very, deliberate, intentional approach to learn a particular word. They might be reading a text and you might find a word and you say, oh, actually, I want to go back to, I'm going to reread it and I'm going to try to guess. So these are really very much conscious processes. So I think in those cases, eye movements might not be a very good indicator of learning, or I think when we look at this relationship, we should probably try to identify different levels of awareness. So yeah, eye movements are attention, but probably is attention at a very low level of awareness. And I think probably we should try to identify different levels of awareness. And I think really it would be the combination of both, of eye movements and interview data, that can actually shed the, that would be the best way to look at learning gains. I think that's but this is certainly something that I'm still, trying to figure out what's the best way to do it, because research findings so far are so, complex and conflicting, and, some studies find a relationship, other studies don't. So I think we're still trying to figure that out.
And maybe I'm just thinking aloud, it might also be interesting to see, like, if it's explicit learning, you would expect maybe the interview stimulated recall data to predict learning more. But maybe in the measures, it would be interesting to see implicit measures, right? Like lexical decision tasks, and see.
Exactly. I think one of the reasons, I think our interest is really to see whether processing measures, eye movement measures are predicting gains and scores. But of course, in doing that, we are comparing, eye movements with very explicit measures, with, vocabulary tests, which tap into this really type of, explicit knowledge. So I think that in the search for this connection, I totally agree with you. I think we should really, use other more implicit measures of vocabulary knowledge as well. And also look, I didn't have time to talk about that, but studies have also looked at a range of eye movement measures. So maybe we find a better connection in early measures or late measures of eye movements. Studies have done that, and so far there doesn't seem to be a clear pattern there. But I think that's certainly the direction to go. Totally.
Thank you.
Thanks. Any other comments or questions?
Hi, Anna. I think we got some interesting questions from YouTube. Kinxin Huang, she's asking, is the triangulation used to reduce the impact of two phenomena? Sometimes there is a fixation, but the participant did not pay attention to the place they looked at, versus some words are processed but are not shown in the fixations and the saccades. Or is it because we don't know what is going on in the mind of the participants?
Yeah, thanks. That's an excellent question. The main reason to use interview data or stimulated recall is because in these contexts of vocabulary learning, language learning from reading, where there are loads of things that are happening at the same time, just by looking at eye movements, as I was saying, they're a very good measure of attention and amount of attention, but we don't really know what's happening in learner's mind. So it's difficult in psycholinguistic studies where we have tightly controlled experiments where there is only one variable that we manipulate and everything else is very controlled. You can look at eye movements, you can make claims about these longer or shorter reading times and interpret them, right? It's easier to interpret them because there is only one variable that actually is manipulated. But in these kind of more applied SLA learning contexts, where there are loads of different factors that are basically in place, is we can look at eye movements and we can make claims about increased attention or increased cognitive effort, but it's difficult to interpret why, what's going on there. And I think this is one of the main reasons for this triangulation of data, is to figure out the why. So with eye movements, we have this precise measure of attention, but I think with stimulated recall data, with interview data, we can tap into the reasons and what's really going on. And as I was saying, these sub-processes that might be encoded in eye movements. But that's an excellent question. Thanks.
Great. So I think we have one more quick question. Benyos, she's asking, thank you very much. It was fascinating. If I remember correctly, L1 reading habits influence L2 reading and learning. Did you ask the participants about the L1 reading habits as well?
Thank you so much. Another excellent question. Absolutely. L1 reading habits influence L2 reading habits. In this study, we didn't ask them about them, but it is, basically for practicalities and time. But this is certainly something that we should be looking at as well. In other studies, people have looked at L1 versus L2 processing patterns. I think in this type of studies, we should try to do something like that and take into consideration L1 reading habits as well. I didn't, unfortunately, but I think it would be really, really interesting and important to look at. Excellent. If that's all, I think it's probably time to move on to the next presentation. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks a lot. And our next and final presenter for today is Kazuya Saito.
Hi everyone. Thank you so much for staying all the way until the end of the Colloquium and also attending my presentation. So let me just quickly here. Okay, so in this talk, I'm going to talk about the how having a good year promotes second language speech learning, and this is a summary of what my colleagues and I have been doing over the past several years. So a very fundamental question in the field of second language acquisition is what's the key to success? And the most obvious answer is more practice is better. But at the very same time, we also know that even if you practice and your friends practice the target language at the same time, exact same way, spending exact same amount of time with the same level of motivation, our outcomes are usually different in the end. This is arguably because certain learners are talented, and these learners are assumed to be able to process second language input more efficiently or effectively, and they, in the end, as a result, lead to more larger learning gains. So, as everyone knows, 50 years of research has been conducted on this topic, aptitude, especially focusing on grammar and vocabulary. The leading scholars include our LSLARF member Peter Sken, and UK-based researcher Paul Miller, or US-based researcher Xiaofen Li, and my colleague Yuichi Suzuki. And they have proposed excellent framework of language aptitude. There are several key distinctions. One of them is the explicit versus implicit. The other one is the domain-specific versus domain general. But in this presentation, what I want to focus on is the more recently, some scholars, including myself, have begun to conceptualize, test, and elaborate on the new framework of aptitude for second language acquisition from a slightly different angle and focusing more on the speech. And our hypothesis is really, really simple. That's having a good year. In academic term, auditory processing is a root of language acquisition. According to this view, language learning is basically governed by our ability, auditory processing ability. What is it? That's the ability to represent and code basic domain general characteristics of acoustic signals, such as pitch, formants, or duration, and intensity. And as you can tell, see here, that this kind of ability is considered to be more basic, fundamental, and bottom-up processing ability relative to a higher order cognitive abilities such as attention control and memory. And this topic, auditory processing and language acquisition, has been extensively researched in L1 literature, and there is cumulative evidence showing that the language problems arise from auditory impairments. So because auditory processing is a gateway to spoken input, if you have problems here, it will immediately affect your speech perception. And therefore, you will likely end up with a lot of difficulty in forming phonetic and phonological categories in your mother tongue. In the end, in the long run, that will lead to more global issues such as reading and speaking. So my research team is generalizing the auditory precision hypothesis to post-pubertal second language learning. Again, focuses a lot on the speech, pronunciation, and perception. And I work with a bunch of people, professors in psychology and SLA and Japan and the UK, and we also work with a bunch of PhD students with a lot of great passion and talent. And so let me just summarize what we have been basically doing. So we have been recruiting a bunch of late bilinguals, so 500, more than 500 Polish, Spanish, Chinese, Japanese, Vietnamese learners of English, and in various settings, so immersion and classroom settings, and their lengths of immersion widely varied from 0 to 20 years. And if they had any immersion experience, they must have arrived in the target language speaking environment, in this case, English speaking environment, after the age of 17. So again, all of them were considered to be late bilinguals. And we checked actually various areas of their second language proficiency, such as phonology, vocabulary, grammar, and we also pay attention to comprehension production skills. And we looked at their auditory processing profiles from two different paradigms. One is a behavioral, the other one is an EEG. And we surveyed exactly what kinds of experience they had been going through, such as the length of foreign language education, or length of immersion, or timing of immersion, intensity of immersion, and age-related variables such as age of onset. And probably this is the one unique selling point of our projects. That's the way how we approach auditory processing from two different paradigms. One is the behavioral. So we ask participants to engage in the AXB discrimination task. So for each trial, they listen to 3 synthesized speech sound samples, and they're always asked to point out which one sounds different from the other 2. So for example, the answer is the last one, 3. The one we actually manipulated the one single acoustic dimension, that's the F2. So in terms of F2, the third stimulus was actually different from the other stimuli. Not only that, but we also use the neuroscience measures, EEG. So in this way, while participants are exposed to the synthesized sounds, we're trying to see how brain is actually reacting to the properties of these sounds. And our analysis is very, very simple. We put all these experience and auditory processing variables into regression or mixed effects models in order to see which factors can relatively explain the outcomes in the second language proficiency. And I'm just going to share with you some overall patterns we found. So not surprisingly, how much they have been using second language English, or how long they have been staying in the English speaking environment, these 2 experience factors explain roughly 20% of the variances in proficiency. But auditory processing factors were found to explain even more substantially or equally the outcomes of second language learning. So in this case, 20 to 30% of variances were explained by these auditory processing factors. And probably this is really interesting to look at. So in this study, which we published in Pellicer-Sanchez in 2021, we tracked the 30 Chinese, international Chinese students in London. And a y-axis is their pronunciation gains over the course of 1 year. And x-axis is their auditory sensitivity. As you can see, there's a huge amount of individual variation on how much they actually improved the pronunciation over 1 year. And this individual variation was greatly explained by how well they were able to represent auditory information as auditory processing. By the way, here the value, smaller values are better auditory sensitivity. And quite recently, we also moved on and to recruit the 70 Japanese EFL students. This time, though, we checked not only their auditory processing abilities, but also other cognitive abilities, such as phonological short-term memory, complex working memory, and pair associates for declarative memory, and serial reaction time for procedural memory, so more like a long-term memory. And then we're trying to see how these factors were related to their second language proficiency, which we measure through a second language speech test. And the findings were, again, quite interesting. First of all, auditory processing was clustered with the serial reaction time, according to our factor analysis. And then this combined composite factor, auditory processing and SRT, this factor was turned out to be a significant predictor of L2 speech learning success. Therefore, we have some quick summary. So auditory perception skills are relatively independent constructs compared to other cognitive abilities such as memory and attention control. And this could serve as a moderate to strong determinant of post-pubertal second language acquisition. And these patterns, we can say, are very much similar to what researchers have already found in the context of first language acquisition. And recently, we just published the synthesis paper on this line of work. So today, I would like to introduce one of the projects that our team is currently working on, and probably this is the most exploratory and maybe controversial one. So I'm very curious to see how the LSLARF members will react to this kind of project. But so if the auditory processing is that important, then the obvious question coming out is why can't we enhance it? Then this is what we're trying to do. If we look at the L1, first language hearing research, there is some evidence showing that a few hours of training, focused training, could enhance various dimensions of auditory processing among children with language disorders such as formant acuity or prosodic acuity. Okay, so there's hope that the training could work even in the context of adult second language learners. So, so far, because of COVID, we can't collect any data face-to-face. Therefore, we have been running all of these things online, which is a little bit tricky. But we have been recruiting more than 100 Japanese learners of English. And then, so we provide them with the online training, 3 different types of training methodologies. One is a phonetic training. And the second one is auditory training. And the third one is a combination of both. And our question, as I said, is very exploratory. So we just want to know which one would stand out the most. And the phonetic training, we are trying, we basically use this very classic forced choice identification task and followed by feedback. The target vowels in this case are low front vowel a versus mid vowel a. So here's the sort of quick screenshot of what the participants were doing. So they hear our target stimulus hat, and they have to choose hat or hat, whichever they think they have heard. And depending on how they answer, they will get the feedback, either correct or wrong. And also they're able to see some total scores in order to see how well they're doing throughout the training. Okay, the other one is probably really controversial, auditory training. So please remember the AXP discrimination task that I explained earlier in order to assess participants' auditory processing. They do the exact same thing. However, this time it comes with the feedback. Okay, let me share with you the how participants are actually doing. So here's the example. So everything was done online. So wrong. Correct. 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 So depending on how well you can, keep answering questions, you can see how well your auditory precision level actually is now. So then you're able to track how well you're doing. Okay. So actually, we have been still collecting data, and actually in this morning, I just finished the preliminary analysis of the entire data set. And this is what we have been finding. For example, in terms of the phonetic training, as the days go on, so first few days, they show huge dramatic improvement. All of them showed very good amount of improvement, but followed by a huge amount of individual variation. This is a really classic pattern of explicit training, learning. But when it comes to auditory training, what was interesting was that the most of the participants seem to continue to improve, enhance their auditory precision slowly but gradually throughout the project. So it looks like more training leads to more precision. Therefore, so far, this is what we are finding. Phonetic training, yes, you can quickly improve but basically you get plateaued very quickly. Auditory training only, you actually enhance your auditory precision a lot, but then it doesn't seem to be transferred to language learning gains. And the combination group, so this group seems to improve both language and also auditory precision. And there is some emerging pattern showing that even their language gains seem to be better than the other two groups. So I am still analyzing data as I speak. So hopefully in the near future, I can share with you the final findings. I'd like to thank the funders, ESRC, Revesz, and Spencer. They actually have made all these things happen. Thank you so much. So I'm very much willing to take on any questions and feedback.
Thank you very much, Kazuya. Thanks a lot for a fascinating presentation. We have some time for questions now.
Mm-hmm.
Questions, comments? Andrea, can see your hand up.
Thank you. I have two questions, Kazuya. This was really exciting, and it's again nice to see the summary of your research and the current study as well. Just in relation to the last study, you had 3 groups, if I understood correctly: phonetic training, auditory training, and phonetics and auditory training. Maybe you mentioned this in the design, but did you have twice as much phonetics training and twice as much auditory training? Because I'm just thinking for the third group, they actually getting twice as much training, right?
Yeah, thank you so much. Actually, that's a 6-day training. So every day they're supposed to spend 30 minutes on this online training. So the combined group, they spend the first, every day they spend 30 minutes, but 15 minutes for auditory training. Okay. Then the other remaining 15 minutes for the speech training. So yeah, so in the combined group, yeah, they actually received a sort of like a, like 50% less than the other, like a auditory only or language only group.
Okay, so that's so clear. And the second question is more, a speculative question, because most of your research focused on the relationship between auditory, ability and speech. Do you think that this would also transfer to other areas of second language learning, like, you know, writing and vocabulary? What do you think?
Yeah, so far we have been looking at the grammatical judgment tasks. We also looked at the Lextel, and we also looking at the way how second language speakers use vocabulary and grammar while speaking spontaneously. Yeah, and then these domains have also been found to be related to auditory processing. But as you can easily tell, the strength of correlation coefficient is much stronger when you just simply focus on pronunciation or the speech perception. But the probably small or medium correlation still can be found for the relationship between auditory precision and higher order linguistic skills such as vocabulary and grammar. Yep. Oh, Peter.
Kazuya, can I ask you, maybe knowing me, you can guess this question was coming. At the beginning, on a slide, you certainly had the words domain general.
That's right.
And obviously, you know, I think what you're doing is domain specific.
You personally
like formant
emailed me.
And pitch manipulation. You're manipulating things you're manipulating aspects of sound which are particularly important for language. You're doing it in a different way to the way people have done it in the past. But you're still working with things where language is very specifically important. How do you say that it's domain general?
Yeah. Actually, the formants, I always use the formants discrimination task as an example how we actually check the auditory processing, and I always call it the domain general. And I think I wrote this back to you in an email, but first of all, this is the way how psychology people have been operationalizing auditory processing, and they use actually several different measures, not only the format, but also pitch and intensity, and all kinds of things that tap into the basic aspects of the sounds. Yeah, and so basically in the end, it's obviously it's really difficult to tell how much all the things we have been dealing with can be defined as domain general or domain specific. But as you said, yeah, pitch and intensity, all the, like processing information could be more like a domain general. And then it's only the format that can be sort of like a gray somewhere in between, like a language and all these other learned behaviors such as music and emotion.
So there's a bit of both.
Bit of both, probably. Yeah.
Okay. Can I ask you another question? Oh, sorry.
Oh, please.
I'll be very quick. In talking about a particular research study, you talked about the combination of auditory processing and an SRT.
Right, yeah, right.
Predicting. Am I right, and I could be totally wrong about this, that the SRT test, which is part of HiLab, isn't it?
That's right, that's exactly right, yeah.
There are two aspects to it, aren't there? There's the basic speed aspect, and there's the implicit learning aspect. Which was involved in the correlation? Or did you?
Actually, I think we just used like a general scores, but sorry, Peter, probably we didn't really tease apart them.
Okay. No, I was just curious, yeah. Because one
so do you think,
is meant to measure fast brain, isn't it? And the other is meant to measure capacity for implicit learning.
Oh, okay. That's a really good advice. I see.
Yeah. No, okay.
So do you think that we should sort of like look at them separately.
Yes, I think it'd be interesting. Yeah. Thank
Excellent.
you.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Peter. I'll continue to work on distinction between general versus specific.
Pauline, your hand's up, I think.
Hi, thank you very much, Kazuya. Hi there, that's great. I've got a much simpler question for you. Just really for clarification, your the training, the auditory training was vowel discrimination, wasn't it, between a and a? And so did you try a variety of vowels? Was it always the same vowel? Have you got any sort of plans for actually expanding this into consonant discrimination, for example?
Yeah, thank you so much, Pauline. Yeah, first of all, following the sort of like what the other researchers have been doing, we just stick to this paradigm. So teaching only one single phonological contrast, in this case, a versus a. And so this throughout the project, they just always practice only one single phonological contrast. Yeah, and in the future, we'll be definitely interested in expanding this to other phonological contrasts, and especially the most difficult, notoriously difficult instance for Japanese speakers of English, that's R and L. And because that's the place where we can see huge amount of individual variation. Some people can get it very quickly, others, takes forever. So that's sort of like a perfect testing ground for aptitude researchers, because the practice alone cannot explain why it's so difficult. It's actually totally feasible for certain people. Yeah.
So basically, the received wisdom is that these phonemic contrasts are kind of learnable by small children, but not by even older children necessarily. So that the ability to recognize the phonemes of a particular language as discrete from each other is very early months of life. And so that, I suppose, the question here is, are you sort of suggesting that that kind of discrimination could be learned post-puberty learners, given enough of the right training? That's what you're heading for. Yeah,
that's exactly right. Yeah, that's right. And when basically, for example, in year one, when infants are really young, basically, like no pre-existing information in terms of phonetic inventory. So, but basically, by the time when you hit the puberty, then your phonetic inventory is quite fixed and stabilized. So if you don't have a flexible auditory processing, whenever you hear any new foreign language sounds, then they're processed as a noise. And so here what we're trying to do is to stimulate and reactivate your auditory processing ability, so that even when new foreign language input is coming into your brain, tell the brain this is not the noise, so you can still perceive the difference. Yeah, so that's what we are trying to do. Because
excellent. Thank you.
It seems that providing language training only doesn't seem to help especially Japanese people acquire RNLs, which is considered to be the most difficult instance. So we need to do something beyond. Then, there could be some solutions such as auditory training.
Okay, no thanks. Fascinating, Kazuya. Thank you.
Thanks, Pauline.
Kazuya, there are a few questions from the YouTube audience. I'll read them out. But one is about, I think you've answered that, is about the critical period to develop auditory processing. So you've been talking about that. Michelle Feng is saying, asking, how did you measure phonetic and auditory precision? The number of attempts before they get the correct choice, or just the correction rate?
Just the correction rate. Yeah.
Excellent. Next one. Do you predict that students with higher auditory sensitivity will have larger pronunciation gains in all aspects of pronunciation, or just in vowel perception production? From Valeria Galimberti.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so that's a really, really good one. Yeah. So, for example, there are several ways to measure and categorize the auditory precision. So, as Peter and I talked about this, so prosthetic acuity, prosthetic discrimination ability is another kind of auditory processing. If you have that, then when, let's say you're learning tonal language, then that really helps you pick up much faster. And the one that Peter and I have been always discussing is the formant acuity, formant discrimination ability. That's more like a consonant and vowel perception and production. So yeah, basically more precise auditory processing leads to more pronunciation gains. But if you take a very careful look, then you can kind of see some interesting detailed relationship.
Great. Another question from Takumi Uchihara is asking whether he's wondering why phonetic training plateaued. Did it involve multiple talkers?
Oh, excellent question. Yeah, of course, it included the multiple talkers as you suggested. So by the way, Takumi is an expert on this topic, high variability phonetic training. So yeah, thank you. Another inspiring comment. Yes, but it isn't. Yeah, but it's interesting. Still, participants easily get plateaued very quickly. I mean, so the training did work. So probably thanks to the high variability, but in the end, it's not like people continue to improve throughout. I mean, some people do, but not all of them.
And with respect to teachability, we have this question by Benio Suzuki. With respect to teachability, the last study, did you or will you compare Japanese participants with participants who grew up bilingually?
Oh yeah, that's another excellent question, because research has also shown that, I mean, as you can easily tell, but bilinguals have a much more precise, not much, but relatively speaking, more precise and flexible auditory precision, simply because they're trained that way. Like throughout their life, they use different languages at the same time. So that's a really excellent question, because this is something that we should really test in the future. Thanks, Benio.
I think there is a final question.
Sure. Thank you.
Let me see if I get it. Yeah, can you?
Oh, yeah.
For the phonetic training, I'm curious of the criteria of the minimal pair choices. In your example, that is a rather than a. Excuse my pronunciation of the minimal.
I see. Yeah, it's just that this distinction of front versus mid and this doesn't really exist in Japanese, and probably, but the thing is, like a sound, we have something quite similar. That's the reason why it would be too easy for Japanese participants. So, so as a first step, we picked this as a kind of still challenging, but still learnable contrast for Japanese speakers of English. And then, as Pauline said, in the future, probably we should really move on to the most difficult, notorious instance R&L for Japanese participants. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the good question.
Any other questions? I think we have now, well, thank you very much, Kazuya, for your presentation.
Thank you.
We have now some few minutes. If there are any other questions or general comments that people want to make about any of the presentations, really, before we say bye. If we've missed any, we'll keep. Yeah, Peter, go ahead.
No, just to say they were all really good. And what an interesting high standard collection they were. And also, I think we all want to thank you, Anna, and Kazuya, who's doing some work in the background as well, for organizing it all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and Kazuya for the technical aspect of it.
Sorry that it didn't work, the first 5 minutes, but it seems like it's working fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see people are still, engaging with the presentations and the comments. So yeah, still working fine.
And special thanks to Eloy and Irene. Thank you so much for taking care of the comments sections on YouTube.
Thank you so much. Any other, Parvaneh? You had a hand up before?
I had my hand up to thank you, Kazuya, Eloy, and Irene, but Peter did it very well.
Excellent. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks, of course, to the presenters and also to everyone who joined the event, our LSLARF members, but also the wider audience who's been joining through the YouTube live stream. The plan is to make it available after the event, so hopefully that will work too. But thanks everyone for coming and joining. There will be more. There will be another of these events in the autumn, so watch the space. Pauline wants to say something. Go ahead.
I feel that I should say this is a very tough act to follow. So if I'm going to be in charge of the next ones, this is a very high bar for me. But I'm assuming that by the time we get round to the PhD conference and the colloquium next year, we'll be let out in public.
Hopefully.
I'm not going to say we definitely will. But I hope that we can do it in a hybrid way. Because I think that would be really good if we can crack the technology to do that reliably. And that would actually, Kazuya, that would exceed the bar that you've set. I'd feel, okay. This has been really great, really interesting. And I hope a hybrid event next time will be at least as great and at least as interesting. That's all. That's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, let's hope for the best that we can actually do that for our next events.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks, Anna.
Thank you, everyone, and watch the space for more announcements about events and our all the news about our LSLARF members. Thank you very much, everyone, and see you soon.
See you. Bye.
Bye. Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, Kazuya. It worked.